In this session, we're going to explore some of the historic environment requirements of the UKFS and elements of the supporting guidance. The session follows the layout of the Forests and Historic Environment UKFS guidelines, which is available on the web. While this session will act as a sound introduction, it's a really good idea to read through the two sections of the guidelines which deal with requirements and guidance. We met both of these documents in session 2 on legislation, guidance and guidelines. The UKFS Forestry Standard is the reference standard for the delivery of sustainable forest management, defining the requirements to achieve this outcome in terms of legal requirements, must, and good forestry practice, should. The UKFS is supported by 8 guidelines. Ours is Forest and Historic Environment, within which the requirements are explored and practical guidance provided as to how to meet them. Within the guidelines, there are a series of icons that are used to explain the role of the information provided. Each of the 8 guidelines has a different colour and symbol for their element. For the historic environment, we have a purple castle. Landscape has green mountain. Biodiversity, a red butterfly. Where you have an exclamation mark or tick, you are looking at a requirement flowing from the UKFS. These are then numbered to ease referencing. Where you have a solitary castle with a number, these are guidance points that explain how to achieve the requirement. It's very important to understand the separation in requirements between legal and good forestry practice. The legal requirements are nothing new. The UKFS is simply highlighting for you the statutory requirements placed on all land managers that must be complied with. In contrast, the good forestry practice requirements identify the balance of the framework that will enable the delivery of sustainable forestry. Since there is the ability within these requirements to balance the potentially competing needs of different elements of the UKFS, they are framed with the word should. This is our first legal requirement. Take a moment to look at the icon on the far left and see our castle, the exclamation mark, showing us that it is a legal requirement and the number of that requirement. Quite simply, this legal requirement reminds you of the statutory protection afforded to scheduled monuments, as we reviewed in session 2. Our second legal requirement breaks into 2 halves. The first sentence covers the law on bona vacantia, that archaeological finds must be reported to Treasure Trove as their ownership rests with the Crown. The second is another element of the protection of scheduled monuments under the 1979 Act, that it's illegal without statutory consent to metal detect on a scheduled monument, regardless of whether you dig or not. The final legal requirement is for listed buildings, highlighting the need for statutory consent before any alteration or demolition. These 3 legal requirements have highlighted the most obvious statutory issues that could affect you, as we've already covered. Non-statutory designations, we covered in session 2, like the inventory of battlefields, are not mentioned as they do not provide statutory constraints. Also, the less obvious statutory issues are omitted. Violation of sepulchre, Protection of Military Remains Act. Their omission does not exempt you from the statutory requirements that flow from them. To achieve the long-term sustainable management of important heritage sites within forestry, like this hill fort in Tayside, requires more than just meeting the statutory minima. This is the role of the 5 good forestry practice requirements that establish the framework for the treatment of the historic environment. They do not provide guidance on how to achieve sustainable management. Rather, they provide a clear set of objectives that need to be delivered. As such, they tie in strongly with the policy which we reviewed in session 2. The first of the 2 good forestry practice requirements, note the tick marks rather than the exclamations, establish our objectives when looking at the integration of forestry with historic landscapes. Note that the first requirement specifies the need for forestry to take account of our landscape issues both when designed, so planned in a compatible way, and managed, highlighting that this is not a design and forget scenario. Our second requirement draws in considering many of the non-statutory requirements we were missing from legal requirements, battlefields, designed landscapes, and requires again the double-barreled input on terms of design and management. These broad historic landscape requirements illustrate the crossover inherent in the 8 elements of the UKFS. In this instance, they are complementary to good forestry practice requirements in the elements for both general forestry practice and landscape. The more you can recognise these links between the elements, the more you will recognise the inherent coherency of what the UKF is seeking to achieve. So, returning to our hill fort in Tayside, we can see a design here that respects the historic landscape of that fort on its hilltop summit and deliver an appropriate broadleaf planted knoll that links into a designed landscape that extends off to the right of the picture. This is a sound design for integrating forestry into this historic landscape, though ongoing management will be necessary to ensure this balance is sustained over time. Our remaining 3 good forestry requirements look at the treatment of individual sites rather than landscapes. Requirement 3 has several aspects to it. It specifies the treatment of sites on an individual basis, so no generic responses. To achieve this, sites have to be known and evaluated. This links back to the work we did in session 3 on HERs and session 4 on taking specialist input on gathering information. The requirement also flags taking advice, linking again to these sessions. But note the limiting phrase of may be adversely affected. Your responsibility does not accrue to sites that will not be impacted upon. And the omission, it does not state that you must protect sites. This links back to the Scottish Historic Environment Policy extract we read in session 2. We need to understand the value of sites so that we can understand the consequence of change, which in turn allows us to decide our reaction on which protection is only one of the options. The remaining 2 requirements both address the reality of forestry, that what may appear to the observer as a static land use is in fact a dynamic, changing environment, even if the time frame for some of the cyclic activity is measured in decades rather than seasons. Our 4th requirement highlights that the important sites to be protected and managed must be identified in the forestry working documents. Design is great, but if it doesn't feed down into action on the ground, it's worthless. Note the links here to requirement 3. We're protecting only those sites we have assessed as important. The ability to differentiate between important and unimportant is delivered by that earlier requirement. Note also the continuing use from the historic landscape requirements of that long-term word, managed. The final good forestry practice requirement is a house cleaning one. We bring up to standard existing forests as the opportunity arises. As is illustrated in this interpretive image of a restocking and redesign of a forestry plantation, down the bottom right of the image, an archaeological site has been revealed within broadleaves. In this instance, that archaeological management is linked into the broader biodiversity aims of the reader design. The next section in the guidelines volume is the presentation of these guidelines. There are 8 factors that are covered by the guidelines, each of which are linked to differing consequences within the management of the historic environment. We are going to touch on portions of 5 of these to illustrate how the guidelines will help you evidence of historic environment, forest planning, woodland heritage, open space and access and interpretation. As you will appreciate, moving through these guidelines, our earlier sessions have all been designed to support the delivery of these guidelines. But remember, it's strongly advised that in addition to this session, you read through the guidelines in full, with this session being used to orientate you as to the desired outcomes they are seeking. Within the evidence factor, we have drawn out 3 guidelines, numbers 4 to 6. Between them, they present the importance of gathering information and seeking advice about the historic environment, looking on the ground for additional traces and commissioning surveys, ensuring forestry workers can recognise sites. This all reinforces, firstly, why you are working through these sessions and the focus of the first 4 sessions in developing an understanding on how you gather historic information about specific sites. When you're gathering this information and gaining an understanding on the ground of this information, it's useful to keep in mind the support that is there in terms of how you deal with the sites. A particularly good example is from the FCS case study from Ulva. Here, programs of survey work were used to understand a relic 19th century landscape, and so, through that understanding, identify areas for protection and retention. The yellow shaded area, and hence areas where planting proposal could be brought forward. Forest planning is our next factor. Through gathering evidence, you can then tackle guidelines like numbers 10 to 12. Clearly, the first seeks to promote full integration of your historic environment information into your forest planning. The second reminds you that any site you are looking to preserve needs to be within an appropriate setting and space. We'll return to open space later. For now, the focus in the latter half of this guideline is for a 20-metre buffer around a scheduled monument. The third guideline, number 12, reminds you that however good the survey work you do is, you may well still have partial information about an important site that inhibits specific forest planning. In this instance, a fallback has been provided for the area concerned with the restriction to planting smaller trees or shrubs. Looking back on that defined 20-metre buffer for scheduled monuments, why so specific for just scheduled monuments? Well, any damage to a scheduled monument, including moving harvesters across it, could prove a statutory offence. This guideline immediately produces a safety buffer of open space around a scheduled monument, both to ensure a minimum clearing and to allow management and accidents to occur without you getting prosecuted. Always a good idea. As you can see from this picture, harvesting operations have the capacity to be organised in a way that does not impact on the scheduled monument within the core of the image. If planting had been tight to the monument, that could be a very challenging situation to avoid a visit to the Sheriff Court. Woodland heritage brings us back to the word manage. We focused on when we looked at the good forest practice requirements. Numbers 15 and 17 promote the monitoring of site condition and the suppression or removal of adverse vegetation. These guidelines are exploring managing heritage sites. What's the point of protecting sites from adverse impacts at the design stage if over 20 years cycle of forestry you ignore the site and allow it to degrade? Remember in session 4 on specialist input, we stressed the need for survey to record the current environmental condition of sites, modern tracks, bracken, trees. This is so you have a baseline of condition. Once you have a baseline, you can monitor change, which is what these guidelines ask you to react to. Of course, maintaining sites within clearings in forests creates additional burdens, preventing woodland or scrub regeneration, suppressing bracken, and doing these tasks without initiating erosion on fragile earthworks and structures. Clearly, there are cost and administrative implications for this. The quality of your initial design comes into play. Realising the downstream costs heightens the benefit of leaving archaeological sites in farmland, so there's no need to manage these sites, leaving it to the professionals at managing grass cover. These diagrams illustrate the importance of open space. In forest planning, we saw the importance of buffers. In woodland heritage, management was stressed. Here, these are repeated in number 18, and with the diagram combined with the suggestion that forming larger clearings will make these tasks easier. Note also in the larger clearing image an access into the clearing, so you can get there to manage the site but not use it as a roadway. Number 19 also expands the role of stewardship. Open settings and heritage sites attract visitors. The management of that impact is as much a task in forest management as bracken or scrub regeneration. Open settings and larger clearings work best where they enable the interpretation and appreciation of the sites. This example shows two potential planting options for an area located close to a prehistoric stone setting, a four-poster. The first option, on the left, continues the planting to the arbitrary buffer line, giving a claustrophobic and isolated atmosphere. The second maintains a cleared area up to a nearby break of slope, maintaining wider views to the surrounding hills. By tweaking the clearing, we retain a better connection with the site's wider landscape setting. The example used was based on a four-poster standing above Loch Tummel, where the view towards neighbouring mountains was clearly very important. Finally, we will touch on access and interpretation. The inclusion of this in the guidelines makes clear that this is an element of sustainable forest management for all of our forests and woodlands. Guidelines 28 to 30 promote considering access, interpretation, and the maintenance of any visitor facilities. Clearly, the importance and location of an individual site or landscape would determine how credible the delivery of these guidelines were. But remember that while the balance of a proposal may not include such access within its objectives, a well-designed scheme will retain the potential through providing access corridors to clearings for maintenance, for access and interpretation to be added during a subsequent redesign or replanting stage. While encouraging visitor access to historic environment sites is vital to promoting wider understanding amongst local communities and the general public, any such access plans must be approached carefully so as to avoid any long-term adverse impacts on the site itself or its setting as a result of foot traffic, for instance. Traditionally, on-site interpretation can be expensive as it's reliant on physical boards that are capable of surviving in the environment, and that's both natural and human environment. However, increasingly heritage trails are being developed through leaflets, podcasts, apps, and other cheaper means of delivering information which is less susceptible to destruction and easier to amend and change. So the requirements within UKFS for the historic environment are quite reasonable, and with appropriate consideration they can be integrated through good forest planning into the forest operations. But there are problems in such a straightforward task. In our next and final session, we will look at some successes and failures. Not to cast blame, but to recognise where things can go right and wrong.